Hello, hi, good morning, everyone. Welcome to this webinar series by Aeon. We'll wait for a couple of more minutes. We'll wait for the people to join and then we'll start. Okay, we have registrations flowing in. Okay, we'll wait for a minute more and then we'll start. Is my screen visible? Arman, can you confirm if the screen is visible? And we should start. Okay, great. Thank you everyone for joining in. It is so wonderful to have you here. My name is Vardhan and I lead the enterprise engagement for Yon Learning Center. The topic of today's webinar is something that touches each one of us personally. It is leadership in disruptive times, right? And we have put months of research together. And I promise, whichever industry you come from, you will have some tangible insights to take back to your work after this session, right? So let's just dive in. Moving on. Okay, so we did a bit of a experiment with our clientele. We reached out to the CHROs, we reached out to the HR heads, and we asked them, what are those 5 priorities that your CEOs think are really important for them? What are those 5 things that your CEOs think is basically keeping them awake at night? What are those 5 priorities that your leadership team is really struggling with, right? And to our surprise, these were the 5 things that were listed. The first one is technology. The second one is workforce. The third one is governance. The fourth one is cybersecurity. And the fifth one is market and regulation. Right. So a bunch of the HR leaders across the country said that these are the 5 things that the leadership teams are really worried about. These are the 5 things which most of the organizations are really trying to grab their head around. But what does it really mean when we say it is technology, right? So what does it really mean when we say workforce? So we did a dipstick, and what we found was that in technology, there's 65% of organizations right now are using AI regularly, which means that it is a 5 times jump from 2022, right? Which means that the organizations are getting tech savvier. Organizations really need to build that digital dexterity as a muscle, and it's not just at the leadership level, now it's across levels. When we say workforce, again, the data suggests that the global engagement level at the workforce is about 21%, which means that we have a multi-generational workforce, which is serving the entire industry where the expectations are not aligned. the multi-generational workforce. The problem is that people have different work ethics, people have different ways of working, and that's why the global engagement level has really dropped to about 21%, which means that it is the most difficult time for the managers right now to handle their teams, and that's why we are seeing the steepest burnouts here. When we say governance, right? So governance, I think in Asia Pacific specifically, the data suggests that it is one of the highest. It is right now at a 6-year high, and shareholder activism is at its peak. We know and we are aware of the organizations where stakeholder activism has really costed the CEOs their tenures. And that's why the organizations are more than vigilant right now to ensure that the governance is taken care of through and through. When we talk about cybersecurity, now this is an interesting one. The data suggests that each cybersecurity breach right now is costing about $4.9 million to the organization, which means that the tech teams in the organizations, the CEO in the organization, they need to be really vigilant around these cybersecurity threats. And now even the boards are actually holding CEOs responsible personally for these cybersecurity breaches, right? And when we say market and regulation, now while on one hand we see that the generative AI market in India is booming, we are expected to hit about a 1.78, 1.79 billion mark by 2027, and it is growing by about 25 to 30% CAGR. But with the growing market, the issue is that the regulation starts to come in, right? With the growing market, you have to really ensure that the data protection is taken care of. With the growing market, you have to ensure that the AI is used to the advantage of the organization and not really to fool the system, right? So the market and regulation, while it looks like a boom, but it's also at some point in time is a curse for the organizations. And if any of you is really aspiring to be the CEO, these are the 5 things that you will be judged on a daily basis, right? So what is the solution, right? So just think about it. Now we know about the disruptions. We can't really handle disruptions through random actions, right? So there has to be a system. So what we did at Aon is that we launched an integrated leadership development model, right? So what this model does is that it really helps leaders to identify 5 leadership facets on which the leaders should really work on. Again, we have put in months of research around building this model. There were a lot of primary research data points that we included. We run an assessment suite, so we were looking at data globally in terms of understanding how are organizations really looking at leadership development in 2025. What are those competencies? What are those leadership facets that organizations are really looking at when they're trying to build their leaders in 2025? Plus, Aon also helps organizations in building some of these competency frameworks. So we have that first-hand data view to understand what are those forward-looking competencies that largely organizations are trying to focus on. There's a lot of primary research that we have also put in terms of speaking to HR leaders to understand how are they making their organizations future ready. Plus, we have also analyzed bunch of research papers that we got from Harvard, that we got from World Economic Forum, and basis all of that is where we created this leadership development model. Now, I want you to stick on to this model for a moment, because in the next slide, what I'm trying to do is really put up disruptions and leadership development facets in the same matrix, right? So let's look at how this matrix would look like. So we now understand what are the disruptions. We now understand what are the areas that leaders really need to focus on, right? So on your left-hand side, these are the disruptions that the research shows is really bothering the CEOs and the leadership team. These are the facets around which largely organizations have started to focus on in terms of building their future ready capabilities, right? And now what we are showing you is a heat map. Now this heat map, if you look at it closely, has 3 different color shades, right? So you have your dark red, you have your medium red, and you have your light red, right? Now what you can okay. So now what you actually see here is basically the priority areas for the leadership team, right? Now, on the dark red side, whatever you see are really the risk zones for the leadership teams right now, which means that they are urgent and important, which means the leaders really need to focus on these risk zones. If you avoid them, either it will cause loss of shareholder value, or the CEO failure, or the organization can also go down. Medium reds are the ones where the cracks have started to show up, which means that it is building in the background. It is not really absolutely urgent as of yesterday, but you really have to start focusing on to ensure that this does not become deep red. And light reds are the ones which are important, but organizations have also started to think on those lines to ensure that they do not become priority or urgent in the next 2 to 3 years coming forward. Right now, if I have to just map it to priorities, right? So while we now understand that this is how the heat map works, how do we put names to some of these cells, right? So we have 25 cells in front of us. How do we put names to each of these cells, right? This is how the heat map looks like right now from an India Inc. standpoint. So on your deep red, what you see are actually the priorities that largely organizations are focusing on, and these are urgent and important. And if you guys are not focusing on, then you should start focusing on them as soon as possible. Medium reds are the ones where the cracks are showing, it is building up in the background, but at the same time, it is a priority. There is no debate that light red is important or medium red is important or dark red is important. Everything is important. It's just about acting quickly on some of these areas, right? Now, because all of us are HR folks here, and if we want to understand this from a competency lens, if you want to understand it and basically put it into a map where we say what should we do differently to ensure that the leadership is getting ready to handle all of these challenges that we see here on the screen. What we have also done is kind of mapped it into a competency model, right? So all those priorities that were there in that previous heat map, they are now being converted into competencies for leadership. So it becomes easier for us to understand and digest where should we really try to focus on, right? And I'll again ask you to just hold on to the slide for a moment. Maybe you can take a screenshot because we'll refer this slide again as I move forward in this deck, right? So while now it is clear for us that there are different potential risk zones for leadership teams, there are potential risk zones for CEOs. What we'll do in the forthcoming slides is basically try and do a trend analysis, right? We'll see the research that we have actually done. Is it really worth the salt or not, right? So we will go back 15 years ago. We will do a timeline analysis of 2010 to 2014, 2015 to 2019, and 2020 to 2025, right? So we'll see what was the priority for the CEO at that point in time, and organizations who acted on that priority, what were the rewards, and organizations who didn't, then what happened to them, right? So for example, we go back to the timeline now between 2010 to 2014. This is how the heat map looked, right? There were a fewer reds. Mostly organizations were trying to focus on building future ready products. Governance had started. People also were trying to look at market and regulation at in bits and pieces. This was a time where two organizations really uh, became famous. One was Kodak, the other one was Apple, right? Now, in these two organizations, remember this was the time where premiumization of the products really started happening. This was the time where per capita income was really increasing. So people were looking at futuristic products. People were looking at good quality products that were getting into the market. This was again a time where Android had started building its ecosystem. So there were a lot of developers who were trying to build apps there. So Android was becoming famous, right? So the message was clear that organizations who were really trying to focus on future looking products will really survive, right? And then we had Kodak. Now, if you look at this was one of the legacy organizations. They had one of the best products of their times, but the leadership was really heavy on legacy. They did not really focused on building future ready products, and then they vanished, right? So the company got collapsed. They had to file for the bankruptcy. On the other hand, where we had Apple, the market cap grew by 3x. They launched their iPhones and iPads, and this was really how, they started changing and shaping the world of tech. And this was one of the most valued organizations just because they focused on leading the future. They focused on products which are really forward looking. They focused on products which are really premium, right? Similarly, now let's try and go to another timeline. If I look at 2015 to 2019, right? This is the time where the Apples were there, the Android ecosystem was there. Now organizations were really trying to look at again future-looking products, but at the same time, if you look at the heat map closely, a lot of light reds have now started to convert into medium reds, which means that the pressure was really building. The heat is spreading at around this time, and it is now getting more competitive from an India Inc. standpoint and a global Inc. standpoint, right? So now we have two organizations again here. Around this time, we had Nokia. Uh, so Nokia was the one which had 35% of market share. Again, they did not pivot into uh, future-looking operating systems. We had Android at that point in time. In fact, a lot of phone manufacturers were looking at Android as the operating system. At the same time, the market was also increasing for Android, right? So you see the market and regulation piece, because people had more per capita income, people were really spending money on having good high-end phones, which had a great operating system, which used to look premium, but Nokia did not pivot there. So hence, they died. The market share fell from 35% to 5%. On the same time, we had Microsoft under the leadership of Satya Nadella. What they did was, like, they were not the first ones to get into the cloud technology. I think Amazon was the first one, but they really focused on building products which were ready for the future. This was not really the AI wave, but really building products and platforms which could support future growth. And under his leadership, Microsoft grew. Right. So the entire market cap grew by 5x in 5 years. And again, there was a lot of value for the shareholders. The CEO was praised globally. The leadership team uh, kind of did well. The organization kind of did well. Right. And these were both, remind you, they were both legacy organizations. They were not organizations which were startups. They had their fair share of market when they started this. Right. Now, let's talk about 2020 to 2025, which is absolutely recent. Look at the heat map now. There are no light reds. It is only medium red and dark red, which means that it is absolutely difficult for the CEOs to run business right now. The pressure is building from everywhere, right? And in this scenario, agility in terms of acting onto these dark, deep reds really is a make or break for the organization, right? So, for example, let's talk about Starbucks, right? In 2024, we saw the exit of the CEO because of shareholder activism, right? The organization acted on that activism piece fairly quickly, right? So what happened was that while they saw an initial dip in the share price, they also hired another CEO from Chipotle, which kind of regained the investor trust. The public image got rebuilt. The valuation of the stock really went up, right? So what it really tells you is that if around this time you are acting on these red areas, these deep red areas, if you take them seriously, if you act on it swiftly, then the market is also trying to reward you there. But if you don't, right? So the initial CEO did not really acted on governance so promptly. In fact, the shareholder activism was the reason why he got kicked out of the organization, right? So but the organization in itself kind of worked on and ensure that they kind of regained trust of the investors, of the public, of the consumers, and they hired another guy, and then you see that the stock prices started to go up, right? So this is how important acting on some of these areas are. And if you are aspiring to be the CEO, or your current CEOs should really start to focus on how these trends are really shaping the entire business landscape as we speak, right? Okay, so now how do we really differentiate it in different industries, right? So while I have shown you what the heat map looks like, how has the heat map evolved in the last 15 years? There has been changes in terms of what are the priority areas for organizations, what are the priority areas for business leaders, how is the entire business landscape kind of growing? But how do I really make it personalized for you? right? So if you look at the slide right now, and for my friends who have joined us from ITS organizations, on your left-hand side, the research shows that these are the priority areas for you right now, right? Again, a lot of them, if you look at it, are from the leading business bucket, where, data-driven decision making is something that you guys really need to focus on. The capital allocation is something that really organizations are trying to place their big bets on. You are also trying to look at how do you build your reputation as a brand within the organization. But again, we cannot ignore light reds and medium reds. Regulatory agility is something that you still have to focus on. But on the right-hand side, what we see are actually the competencies that largely organizations who are future ready are trying to focus on, right? So maybe again, you can pause here and take a screenshot if you are from ITS. On the right-hand side are the competencies that largely forward-looking tech organizations are focusing on when they're trying to build leaders. Similarly, if we go to another industry, which is BFSI, now on the left-hand side, there is again the heat map, which is very specific to the industry. It's not a India Inc. heat map. It is very specific to BFSI. So your regulatory compliance is something that organizations are trying to focus on. Data-driven decision making is something that you're trying to really focus on. Tech innovation. But on the right-hand side are the associated underlying competencies that largely leading BFSI organizations are focusing on when they're trying to develop leaders. Right? Again, anyone who is from BFSI can pause here and take a screenshot. Moving forward. Okay, another interesting industry which is manufacturing and auto, right? This is a large bucket for us. From an India Inc. standpoint, there are a bunch of manufacturing and auto organizations. In fact, manufacturing also contribute to about 15% of the total GDP. And if you look at it closely, there's an interesting mix, right? A bunch of the deep red areas are under leading business. So, which means that you again have to be digitally savvy. You have to take data-driven decision making. Talent strategy is something which most of the manufacturing and auto organizations are really struggling with. There is a constant shortage of high-skilled workforce, which the CEOs are really concerned about. We look at capital allocation. They have to place big bets, and especially with the EV coming in, you'll have to really place big bets in terms of how do you pivot yourself as an auto component or auto OEM manufacturer to EV. At the same time, the semiconductors, how do you really get those right to ensure that the entire ecosystem of auto is not really hampered, right? And again, on the right-hand side, you see some of these competencies that are really uh, relevant for auto organizations when they're trying to build leadership. Now let's go to pharma and healthcare. Again, it is the heat map on the left hand side. We are trying to build. There are because pharma has historically been a very regulated industry. We don't see it as a pressing need right now for pharma because there is a culture of compliance which is already there in pharma. But there are other needs. When it comes to again data-driven decisions, it comes to talent strategy again, which is a big one for organizations. There is reputation which is at stake for large pharma organizations. But again, on the right-hand side, what we are trying to show you are the competencies which pharma organizations are trying to focus on when they're trying to build their top leadership. And then, the final industry, which is consumer and retail, right? Again, this is very similar to the heat map that we saw in the manufacturing and auto space. A bunch of these deep red areas are there in the leading business front, where most of the organizations are trying to get the strategy right, they're trying to get the capital allocation right, they're trying to get more digitally savvy. Digital dexterity is a skill that largely organizations are trying to build. At the same time, on the right hand side are some of these competencies which large FMCG, FMCD, and retail organizations are trying to focus on when they're trying to build one-on-one leadership, right? While now this is more like a macro view. If I have to tell you how can you create your own personalized heat map for the organization, what should you be doing, right? And I think these are the five areas that you should be focusing on in case you want to build your own personalized heat map, right? So we looked at data from different industries. We looked at the projects that we have been running with organizations in terms of understanding how are they trying to build future ready leaders in this disruptive times. Through all of this, we could conclude that there are five areas through which leaders are trying to really build their own personalized heat map, right? So the first thing that you should focus on as an HR leader is what is your organization's value, vision, and mission, right? What do you really stand for? What are you really doing in terms of the organization, in terms of the environment? What are you really trying to do? That is the first thing that you should focus on. The second thing that one should focus on is your current talent readiness, right? So while at one hand why do you exist, on the second hand, because now you know what are you trying to achieve, what is your current leadership talent looking like, what are you really trying to what you're trying to build, do you really have talent, the baseline talent for that? The third thing that you should right now focus on is the regulatory environment, right? Because with the growing landscape, especially from an India Inc. standpoint, you will see the regulators have really become stricter in the last 5, 6 years. And if you talk about BFSI, you talk about pharma, you talk about ESG as a concept. I think a bunch of organizations are really trying to wrap their head around on how do they make it much more regulatory compliant than ever. So for you to create your heat map, it's really important for you to also look at your own regulatory environment. Then we also showed you how the industry heat maps look like, right? So if whatever industry you guys come from, you cannot escape that heat map. So that should be the point of reference for you if you're trying to build your own personalized heat map for the organization, right? And the last thing that you should focus on is what is your business imperative, right? What are your growth plans? Where do you want to go? What are the regions that you want to expand in, right? So if you combine all these five, which is your organization's vision, mission, values, you combine your current talent readiness, you combine your regulatory environment, you look at how the industry heat map looks like, and then you also put together what are you really gunning for. It will be able to give you your personalized heat map in terms of understanding and identifying dark red, medium red, and light reds for you, right? So what is the message that we are trying to deliver, right? And we are towards the end of the session. The message that we are trying to deliver is that you have to focus on the potential risk zones, right? If as a leader, as a CEO, if you're not really focusing on these red zones, potential risk zones for leadership, then there might be a situation where the CEOs will be held liable, the organizations will go down, the shareholder value will be lost, right? But there is hope at the end of it, right? Like what we saw in the case of Starbucks. If you act quickly on these red zones, you will see that the market is also rewarding you, very, very quickly, right? So you just have to be agile. You just have to be laser focused. You have to understand your personalized heat maps and really start working towards it in case you want to be relevant and sustainable in this business environment, right? So with this, I'll close the session. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining in. I hope this session was insightful, and I look forward to seeing you very, very soon. Thank you so much.